Hello. In this video, I'm going to talk about the difference between the active and passive voice. So one of the myths associated with grammar is like never use the passive voice. Sometimes the passive voice is in fact appropriate. It's just really useful to understand what the difference is between the active and passive voice. So we're going to talk about that in this video. And the place that we're going to start is by talking about the difference between something being stylistically awkward versus incorrect. And this is important because passive voice is not incorrect. Okay. And what that means is that sometimes it may not be appropriate. It might be stylistically awkward, but it is not, in fact, an incorrect grammatical construction. So the example you see here, the salad was eaten, is a passive construction. Okay. So this is passive voice. And we know it's passive voice for several reasons. Okay. Um, the first reason is that the subject is missing. Okay. The salad was eaten. We don't know who ate it. And so that is the subject that is missing, right? Who ate it? The other reason that we know that it is a passive construction is because of the verb phrase was eaten, which is a form of the verb to be plus a perfect participle. And that blend only happens when we're dealing with the passive voice. So for instance, if we wanted to change this, we might say, let's see, the students ate the salad. Right? And what this does is it puts everything back in their appropriate place. Subject, verb, direct object. What's happening here is that we have the verb and technically the direct object, but we're dropping the subject, and that creates a passive voice construction. Okay. If I say the salad was eaten, you still understand what I mean, which is that the salad is gone. And what I'm suggesting by putting it in that construction is that who ate it doesn't actually matter. All that matters is that the salad was eaten. And maybe it's because I really want the salad. So we use the passive voice when the object is more important than the subject in the sentence. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more as we take a look at the agent versus the patient role. So in terms of grammar, there are several different roles that words can fill in a sentence. So the agent role is usually a noun phrase that intentionally acts. Okay. Whereas the patient role is a little different. The patient role is a noun phrase often that changes as a result of the agent's action. Okay. So those are the kind of two different roles that noun phrases can play. What's happening when we do a passive construction um, is that the patient role is most important in a passive voice construction. Okay. So let's take a look at a couple of different examples. I just want us to start by identifying the agent and the patient role in these sentences, and then we'll look at how we actually make them passive and what the effects of that are. So both of these sentences were taken from Sarah J. Maas's A Court of Mist and Fury, so published sentences. I think that's a nice place to kind of start or to work with. So let's take a look. I carefully disassembled the snare. So I is a pronoun, it's a noun phrase. The snare is also a noun phrase. And here I is the subject, snare is the direct object, which means that I is the agent and snare is the patient. Okay. Then I unlocked the door. Once again, I is our subject. It's a noun phrase, so it's our agent. And unlocked, the door is the one being unlocked. So the door is the direct object or the patient. Okay, so let's then talk about the process of passivization. What we're doing when we make something passive is that we are switching the positions of the subject and the direct object. We are also using a form of the verb to be with the perfect participle. Okay. So was eaten, right? We would usually say had eaten or was eating because we have the perfect participle with the auxiliary verb was. We have a passive construction. We might have are locked, right? So once again, that would be a passive construction that would help us in the process of passivization. So then let's apply these to the sentences that we looked at before, and try to make them passive. So I carefully disassembled the snare. So the first thing that we're doing if we're making it passive is we're switching the positions of the subject and direct object. So then instead we know this sentence is going to begin with the snare instead of end with it, right? Um, Carefully disassembled. Carefully is an adverb, disassembled is the verb. And we are going to add a form of the verb be along with the perfect participle of disassemble. So that would become, right? We've got to match tense. So disassembled is past tense. So we need a past tense auxiliary verb and it needs to match with the snare. So we would say was. And actually, we don't want to drop our adverb. So was carefully disassembled. Okay. And we can just leave it at that. If we wanted to, we could say by me and then end after the sentence. But by moving the snare to the front, we're saying the direct object is the most important. So it's easy to drop the subject. And so I'll add here and often drop the subject. Okay, so we have just made I carefully disassembled the snare into a passive construction. The snare was disassembled. It doesn't matter that I was the one who did it. So with that, right, we have our passive construction. Our direct object becomes the subject, and we have a passive verb form. Okay. Let's look at the next sentence and try this again. Then I unlocked the door. Well, we're going to leave then, right? But we're going to switch the direct object with the subject. So the door. And we're going to add be with the perfect participle. So was unlocked. And we can end it. And once again, that would be by me. So we have the direct object that then becomes the subject, and we have the passive verb form. Okay. So the thing to think about with passive voice is, when is the passive voice appropriate? Because sometimes it is, in fact, appropriate. So the passive voice is appropriate when the direct object is more important than the subject of a sentence. Okay. And this happens quite a lot in science writing. Right? The samples were collected. It does not matter who collected them. It's all about what, right? Like the fact that the samples were collected. The results um were um let's see, were mm, having a tough time with that one. I'm going to erase it, but you get the point. I am not a scientist. Apologies. But you'll notice that the passive construction does happen frequently in science writing. Lastly, I want to talk about some passive verb forms. There are two main types of passive verb forms, the stative and the inchoate, which is also talked about as the got passive. So I'm just going to explain what those are. Once again, I'm not super concerned with you remembering all of the terminology. I just want you to know that it exists, what's significant about it all, and kind of where it comes from, so that if you ever need to look it up, you can. The stative passive verb form literally means that the agent is in a state, right? He became married. Okay. Um, he enters into a state. So this is technically a passive construction. An active construction would be something more along the lines of like, he married like so and so, right? So this is passing into a state, thus it is stative. We also do this using the auxiliary verb got, which is technically in linguistic terms called the inchoate passive verb form. But basically what this marks is an entry into a state. And we do it especially in speech all the time. He got married. Okay. Still passive, right? They married each other. He married her. He married him. That would be active. This is technically a passive verb form because it's something that's happening to him, right? Like it's a state that he's being brought into. It's not an action that he's taking. So hopefully this is helpful. We will be looking at identifying active and passive voice. Again, one is not more right than the other. It really just depends on the rhetorical situation, which will determine whether or not the direct object in a sentence is in fact more important than the subject.